that was it, and I remember going down. I remember the look on the customs officials' faces when they stamped our passports, as if to say, well, we're never going to see these boys again. They did look at us and they said, you're mad for doing this. But going back to the risk assessment side of things, we knew we'd done everything we possibly could. There was nothing we had left to chance. So it was time to set off. And we rowed out of Agadir Harbour. The sun was just coming up. The sea was just like glass. It was perfect. And we looked at that, and Dave rowed us out. So we had an agreement that whoever rowed out, the other one rowed into the other side when we arrived in Barbados.
That's Lloyd Figgins, and this is the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. My name is Ben Catania. This is my show, which is all about embracing uncertainty. And today I have Lloyd Figgins on the show. And if that name sounds familiar to you, that might be because I've had Lloyd on previously, episode 93 to be exact. Lloyd is a travel risk expert, author, adventurer, and speaker. This episode, however, is all about Lloyd's 2012 row across the Atlantic Ocean from Morocco to Barbados on a plywood boat with his friend David Whiddon. And I'm going to keep this introduction short because, quite frankly, no introduction can do this amazing conversation justice. What I will say, however, is that after doing 120 plus episodes of All Things Risk, it's kind of hard not to have a few favorites. This episode is definitely one of my favorites. It embodies my personal philosophy and the philosophy of the show, embrace uncertainty. And I will leave you with that. Here's Lloyd Figgins and his row across the Atlantic Ocean. Enjoy. Lloyd, welcome back.
Well, thank you for having me back.
It's been about, a year since we've...
I think it was about a year, yeah.
What have you been up to since then?
Well, a lot of it has been to do with the TRIP group, which we've mentioned in the first podcast, Travel Risk and Incident Prevention Group. So we have expanded massively. So we now have over 600 member organisations as part of that group. We meet 4 times a year, great events, which my colleague Christine puts together. Absolutely amazing. So couldn't have expected anything better, but there's a lot of hard work.
Fantastic. Well, anything that's worth doing is something that requires hard work. So great. We'll talk about going on trips fairly shortly because I wanted to talk to you about your great row across the Atlantic. And we can pull out some of the lessons from that. But actually, before we do that, my listenership has grown since we spoke last.
Excellent.
I would love if you could just explain to maybe new listeners who you are and what you do.
Yep, so my name is Lloyd Figgins and I am a travel risk expert. So I do a lot of work in the media, usually commentating when things have generally gone pretty badly wrong. But my expertise really comes from having worked in lots of different places around the world, usually the sort of more remote and hostile environments that people often don't want to go to, and actually looking at solutions how people can travel, but to do so safely. So that's really my background. So rowing across the Atlantic was almost an extension of what I did for a living anyway. The only difference was that it was an environment I wasn't particularly familiar with.
Well, let's get into that. First of all, where does an idea like that come from?
It's an interesting one, Ben, because I think that everybody has their own Everest, their own moonshot, that one thing that they really want to do. So I looked at climbing mountains, but dismissed it pretty quickly because I'm scared of heights. I knew I was never going to be intelligent enough to be an astronaut, so dismissed that one. And I've always had a love of the ocean. I was born near the ocean. I grew up near the ocean. And every time I look at the ocean, I'm always looking at the horizon and wondering, I wonder what's over there. You know, it's like you're looking for adventure, aren't you? And I was thinking, I just want to get to that next horizon. So I then found out that there was this crazy bunch of people called ocean rowers, and there was even an ocean rowing society. So got in touch with them and said, look, I'm kind of interested in this. What do I need? And of course, they came back with the obvious answer to that was, well, the first thing you need is a boat. And although that sounds really, really obvious, it's got another side to it. So usually when you're undertaking a major expedition like this, there's a few things you need, and one is funding, and through sponsorship. And no one will take you seriously unless you have a boat. Mm-hmm. So if you just go to them with an idea, there is no way they're going to part with their money. There's no way that they're going to give you equipment or support unless they think you're serious. And the one thing that's going to tell them that you're serious is a boat.
Okay. We're probably not talking just any old boat. So what does it take? Like what kind of boat do you use to...
So we used what was referred to as a Woodvale class rowing boat, and it's made of marine plywood. And it's 23 feet long. It has a cabin, which at push you can get 2 grown men into it. And then it's got an open deck and a forward cabin, which really is just used for storing equipment. And then there's storage within the under the deck in the hull. So it's actually really quite basic, but it has self-righting capabilities. So if you capsize it, as long as you have your ballast in the right place, it will self-right. Fully laden, probably weighs between 1/4 and 1/2 ton. And obviously, as you go through your row, that becomes lighter because you're eating supplies and things like that, and you yourself are losing weight. But it's still quite a weight to row. But brilliantly well-designed things, really well-designed things. And the boat that we bought had already crossed the ocean twice before, so it knew the way, which was helpful. But yeah, it was a lovely boat. But we bought it from a former ocean rower. It was in pretty good condition. We looked at loads of different boats in varying degrees of condition. And she was just, she had so much right with her. But even then, we still had to strip her back down to basics, because the important thing, and for anyone doing any expedition, you need to know what you're going in. And in order to know what you're doing in, you have to break it down and then build it up again. Because when you're in the middle of an ocean and you've got 50-foot waves pounding you, you need to know everything about that boat. It needs to be part of you. So we still had to go through that process.
So this is back in 2012.
This was actually so the project actually started in 2010. And again, for anyone wanting to do something like this, it's not something that happens overnight. You don't go out and buy a boat and then, a couple of weeks later decide to row across an ocean. There's a huge amount of preparation. There's a huge amount of planning that goes into it. And the planning and the preparation is the major part of the expedition. That's the hard part. Getting to the start line is the difficult bit. The actual row is what you have to do in order to achieve your objective. So getting to the start line, we bought the boat in 2010. We spent most of 2011 doing it up and getting everything we needed on it and in it, including navigation equipment, including automatic identification systems, CME, which is they're both anti-collision devices, and practicing. So we would go out. The expedition we were based in Poole in Dorset, and we would go out in Poole Harbour every weekend in the winter, in the summer, in the spring, and train. And we would train for every eventuality. And then the actual expedition launched from Agadir in Morocco. So towards the end of 2011, we shipped the boat out there. So the boat went on a container vessel. We flew out to Agadir, met it in Agadir, and then had a whole load more stuff that we had to do there before we actually set off. So it's a long process. But we were meticulous about our planning, not just about the boat. The boat is one aspect of it, and the equipment, the supplies that go into that, getting your food, making sure it's the right type of food, making sure you've got the right diet that's going to suit your training, and then getting that training done as well.
There's a lot there. I just want to maybe back up a little bit. So something like that, you gave us a nice sense of how it probably just takes over your life.
Oh, absolutely.
So how did you accommodate anything else that you had going on to do this thing, first of all?
It's like you're living two lives.
Okay.
And so we're both still working full time.
And you and your colleague?
My rowing partner. So he's a great chap called David Whiddon, and he works for the RNLI, the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, as a sea survival instructor, which was quite beneficial in many respects. But we were raising funds for the RNLI as well. So that was the charity that we were raising funds for. So David was working full-time, I was working full-time, and then in the evenings you've got to find time to do your training, you've got to find time to work on the boat, and your weekends, any spare time you've got is just dedicated to the project. And I honestly think it's the only way you can do it. You cannot do it in any other way. This is not a part-time process. So you are leading a double life. You really, really are. And what I think that people who aren't or haven't been through this don't understand is that it is all-consuming. You eat, sleep, drink, think about it the whole time, and your vision is on that goal. It is on not just setting off, but achieving the end game, which is getting to the other side. And when you've got 3,200 miles of open ocean between you and your goal, you know that you have really got to put in the preparation for it.
I can only imagine what that must have been like. What are some of the things that you talked a little bit about the boat itself?
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you had to anticipate? What are some of the things, if you cast yourself back to pre-event planning, what are the types of things you talked about? Big waves. What are some of the things that can go wrong, actually?
Yeah, well, there's a lot that can go wrong, and there's one or two things that can go right, and you just hope that one outweighs the other. But as you can imagine, with my line of work, writing the risk assessments, doing the risk assessments, fell to me. And we looked at every hazard that we might encounter. So that included things like, submerged containers that had fallen off vessels, and that could even mean, things like half-submerged refrigerators or freezers that, people do collide with when they're on an ocean. We looked at shipping. We looked at sea life, so sharks, whales, all of these things that might, potentially do us harm. There was an account of, in fact, our boat, when it last crossed previously, had been attacked by a short fin mako shark, and it had holed the bottom of the boat.
Wow.
So we realised that sort of thing was dangerous. Shipping, major hazard, because imagine this. You are crossing, so if you think from, say, Cape Town, South Africa, up to Europe, you've got some of the world's busiest shipping lanes, and you've got ships, massive ships, that are travelling about 20, 25 knots up and down that shipping channel all day, every day, day and night. And part of our route was that we would be crossing that major shipping lane in quite possibly, if not most definitely, the slowest moving ocean vessel. So that created a massive issue for us. And then put on top of that the weather conditions, where we had somebody who was doing a weather router who looks at the weather systems and tries to, guide you as best they possibly can. But because you're in such a slow-moving vessel and you're basically moving under your own power, when they told us that there was a storm coming, it wasn't a case that we could change course to get out of the way of that storm. We couldn't. It was a case, quite literally, of battening down the hatches and riding it out. Now, that sounds okay when you're writing a risk assessment, but when you're in it, it's a totally different kettle of fish. So, we looked at all these different risks, and part of that risk assessment process, and I know this is not in any manual anywhere, but both of us would wake up in the middle of a night in a cold sweat, having just thought of something else that could potentially go wrong. And the next morning we'd ring one another and say, we need to look at this. We need to come up with a solution. We need to come up with something to mitigate if this happens. And so that was part of the risk assessment process.
Right.
Is continually thinking about what can go wrong and how we're going to overcome it.
Did you involve other people in that process?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we really drew on the expertise of others. So previous ocean rowers. Perhaps the most famous pairing would have been James Cracknell and Ben Fogle. So we spoke to both Ben and James on separate occasions about the hardships they faced. And interestingly, by speaking to them separately, they actually came up with different things, because everybody has their own fears. And we did this with a number of other ocean rowers, including two who had crossed the North Pacific, and nearly crossed the North Pacific. As they were approaching the US coast, they got mown down and their boat was actually broken in two by a trawler. Luckily they survived and they were rescued, but they gave us a whole load of information about things to look out for and things that they would do differently if they were to do it again. So getting all that information is absolutely key to the success of your mission, by learning from other people's successes but also their failures. And so it was really, really important for us to get as much information about the mission and what we were going to hopefully accomplish, and then build that into our risk analysis in order that we were best prepared for it. And part of that was preparing our minds and preparing our bodies as well.
I can imagine as well. Were you both rowers before? Did you have a rowing background?
No.
Okay.
No, and it's interesting, because even if you did have a rowing background, most rowing is done on inland waterways. Ocean rowing is a different sport. So if you think that when you watch the boat race or something like that, they are rowing in unison, and they row in very regimented fashion. We were going to be rowing. Only one person was rowing at a time. Okay. So one person rows and the other one rests. So it's 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, until you hit sand. So There's no rest in that. Okay. So the other thing is the ocean, because it's continually moving. It's not like a flat piece of water.
It's moving you around.
So it's moving you around. So sometimes you're only rowing with one oar. Okay, or you're rowing on one side, and one time one oar's all the way up in the air and the other one's right down in the water. So it's not the same discipline as you would have. So even if you did have a rowing background, as James Cracknell, clearly, having won a few Olympic gold medals, had a really great rowing credibility and pedigree. But actually, when you're on the ocean, it doesn't help you a huge amount.
So how do you physically train for something like that?
Well, it's interesting, because I was actually at the time when we were going through this, I was doing a lot of work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, in eastern DRC, which even today is considered one of the most dangerous parts of the world. And I remember I'd set up a BGAN satellite communication device, and I was working in the middle of this jungle in this little encampment. And I got my laptop up and I managed to get a signal on the BGAN, and I researched universities which had a sports science department, and it turned out that Bournemouth University have an academy of performance coaching for sports science, and of course Bournemouth is just around the corner from where we were based in Poole. So there in the middle of the jungle in the DRC, I sent a speculative email to Bournemouth University, basically saying, this is what we're planning on doing. Would you be interested in doing, some coaching for us? And I thought, I'll probably never hear a single thing from them. And the next time, a couple of days later, I got a satellite link up again, and there was a response. And it basically said, listen, we'd be really interested in doing this with you. There's just, the proviso would be that we have unlimited access to your bodies and your minds because we'll need to do the physical aspects of it, but also the sports psychology aspects of it. And we will need access to you for a minimum period of a year. So I agreed to that, said, yeah, absolutely, no problem at all, and then just wondered how I was going to explain to Dave that I'd just sold his body to scientific research. But they were fantastic. Bournemouth University, true to their word, they brought in former Olympic rowers to teach us about which parts of our body to strengthen. So a lot of people think that, you do your upper body, chest, arms, and all that sort of stuff, shoulders. And it's not. Most of it is actually in your core and in your legs, and making sure, because we had a sliding seat on the boat. But the core was the most important thing. So getting that core strength was imperative to our success. But also they brought in a chap called Dave Allred. Now, Dave Allred is famous for being Johnny Wilkinson's mental preparation coach. And Dave was brilliant to us. He did a lot of the mental preparation with us, and he has a mentality which he calls training ugly. And training ugly involves making your training harder than the event itself, which is fine if you are playing 80 minutes of rugby or a 4-hour round of golf or whatever. But when your expedition, your challenge could take 100 days, it's very difficult to make your training harder than the event's going to be. So Dave would come up with ways of really challenging us and making it hard. And one of the first things that they did with us is they got us into what they referred to as their lab, which had treadmills, rowing machines and stuff like this with all these wires attached to them. And the first thing they did is they tried to get a threshold of where we were no longer capable of making sound mental decisions. So what they do is they work your body to the point where there's a lack of oxygen going to your brain. And then when they get to a point where you can no longer solve simple mathematical sums or spell things, then they know that actually that's when your body is depleted of oxygen, and that was the threshold they started at. And they said, right, okay, so we need to get you above this. So even if you are in the middle of the ocean, there's a big storm, and you're not thinking straight, you need to be fit enough to be able to get yourself out of that situation. You need to make sound mental decisions. Now, at the time, I worked 18 miles away from my house, and I used to take the train every day to work. So they said, well, could you cycle to work? And I said, yeah, absolutely. No problem with that at all, particularly in the summer. It's great. And they said, great. And they gave me a heart rate monitor and a chest strap. And they said, we need you when you cycle to and from work. So that works out, 18 miles each way. They said, we need you to do that cycle ride at 90% of max heart rate. So I was operating, and the evil piece of equipment because if you fell below 90% of max heart rate, it started sending out an alarm saying you need to work harder, which the fitter you get means you've got to drop gears on your bike in order to get that heart rate back up. So this was physically, it was really, really demanding. Now that cycle ride, when I first started doing it, it took about 2 hours or something like that. By the end of it, I was doing that exact same cycle ride in about an hour and 15 minutes. Sometimes shorter than that. And it was absolutely, you can just feel yourself getting fitter. And with that, your mind changes as well. And so the two go hand in hand. And I would say that, having done what I did, the mental side of things is so much more important than the physical side of things. If you can get your body into shape, that's one thing. Getting your mind into a shape where you believe that you can do it, and they throw anything at you and you can overcome it, then you are in a really, really good position to then go and undertake, an extreme challenge.
That makes a lot of sense. But was this over the course of a few weeks? The
physical training in earnest took about 10 months.
Wow.
And the interesting thing was as we got nearer and nearer the time that we were going to be flying out to Morocco, they have this horrible thing called tapering. For those listeners who don't know, tapering means that you've actually really done the hard bit, but then you taper off because you need to have the physicality in order to actually undertake the challenge. You don't want to go into that challenge being exhausted, so they have this tapering thing. So the other thing that they did, so you can imagine in the, I suppose, August, September, October of 2011, we were in absolute top physical and mental condition. We were flying out to Morocco in the November, so they started the tapering around the October, end of October into November. And as part of that, and as part of the sports nutrition side of things, we had to eat a lot of fat. So you go from being in this incredible physical shape to having to eat lots and lots of fat. And all of a sudden you see this wonderful shape starting to disappear.
Right.
And you're thinking, well, why are they getting us to do this? Because, and we said, what can we eat? And they went, eat whatever you want. Just put on weight. You need to have fat on you because your body is going to be burning a huge amount of fat when you set off. So anyway, we kind of didn't really believe them, if I'm honest with you, but we got out to Morocco and we then had the whole process of preparing the boat again, but also waiting for the right weather window.
Okay.
So we used to go and see the harbour master every day, lovely guy, and he really had our best interests at heart. And he said, look, no pair have ever successfully rowed this Morocco to Caribbean route. And he said there's a number of reasons for it. So he said the channel between Morocco, the mainland of Morocco and the Canary Islands, which is, there's a current that runs down. And he said if you hit that, it's called the Canaries Current. He said if you hit the Canaries Current, it will sweep you south and west past the southern end of the Canary Islands. He said the problem is if the wind's blowing back towards Morocco, he said there's nothing you can do. You will
going backwards.
You're basically going to end up down in Western Sahara, smashed up against the rocks, and there's no one who can rescue you there. So he said we need to make sure that the weather conditions are absolutely perfect for you to set off, which means that we had to wait around longer than we thought, and we trusted this guy. We really, really trusted him. So we spent our time in Agadir getting the boat ready, doing everything we could, practicing man overboard drills, just training, and eating pizza and getting fat. And every day we'd go and see him, and we'd say, look, are we ready to go? He would show us the charts, and he'd go, sorry. And we would look, and we'd say, but it looks fine. He went, trust me, it's not. He said, 20, 30 miles out to sea, you're going to run into trouble. He said, we can't have that. He said, you need to get a good 20, 30 miles offshore. You'll hopefully pick up the current, and then that will sweep you down. He said, it's my responsibility. He said, I don't want to come out and rescue you. So we kind of went with that while we got fatter. And then one day we went to see him, as we did every evening, expecting exactly the same response. And we walked into his office, and which was on the harbour, and he said, you're going at dawn. He said, there's a very small window of opportunity, but you're going. And then everything became really real to us. So we went home, or went back to our apartment, and we called our families. And we said, this is it, we're going. Tomorrow morning, before the sun's even up, we've got to go to the customs post, we've got to have our passport stamped, and then we're off. And neither of us slept that night. Everything changes. You've got this little bag that you've been living out of, which is now going to go on the boat with you, and that's it. You're out of Morocco. The next time you see land, is going to be a number of months later.
How long was it before you got to Morocco and then set off?
3 weeks.
3 weeks of eating pizza.
Yeah, 3 weeks of eating pizza and drinking beer. Yeah. That's not a great fitness
and
regime.
Psychologically, it's tough as well, because you talk about athletes who know when kickoff is during a match, and they get psyched up and ready to go, and that having those sort of highs and lows every day of could it be today or not, or and you have to just be ready to go.
Yeah, you do, and we tried as best we could. We did things like if the surf came in, we'd go surfing. We tried to mentally keep ourselves, and physically in a place that we were prepared and we were ready to go. But I don't think there was anything that prepared us, for just walking into that office and seeing the harbour master's face and him saying, "You're going at dawn." And even to this day, I kind of think, it is what we'd trained for, what we prepared for, and now it was going to happen. And that was it, And I remember going down, I remember the look on the customs officials' faces when they stamped our passports, as if to say, well, we're never going to see these boys again. They did look at us and they said, you're mad for doing this. But going back to the risk assessment side of things, we knew we'd done everything we possibly could. There was nothing we had left to chance. So it was time to set off. And we rowed out of Agadir Harbour, and the sun was just coming up. The sea was just like glass. It was perfect. And we looked at that, and Dave rowed us out. So we had an agreement that whoever rowed out, the other one rowed into the other side when we arrived in Barbados. So Dave rowed us out of Agadir, and it was beautiful. And we then immediately got into our regime. And so we had a very, very strict regime.
Yeah, walk us through that. What did that look like, a typical day?
So we did the 2 hours on, the 2 hours off, but we always set time aside in the evening with one another. Because although you're on a boat with another person, you often don't have a lot to do with that other person because one of you is rowing and one of you is resting. Now, the other person during the day might be resting on deck. They might be with you, but you're actually lost in your own thoughts largely. So one of the things that we implemented was that we would always have an hour in the evening when we had dinner to actually talk to one another, assess how we'd got on that day, and what our objectives were for the following day. But also to take that time, we had a satellite phone with us to read text messages from family. So we had set up a thing where they could text us for free, so they could send as many messages as they want. It wasn't going to cost anyone anything, and we picked those up. And of course, when we set off, it was near Christmas, so people were clearly sending us good wishes about that. But the routine for the day was really quite basic. That you got up. If you were resting that last shift, you took over rowing from the guy who'd then been rowing for the last 2 hours. That person might decide to have their breakfast, before they took over rowing, and then the person who had just finished their shift would have their breakfast and then perhaps go and sleep for a couple of hours. And then there's actually quite a lot to do on deck. It's making sure that everything is where it should be, checking, making sure the water maker is working, making sure your communication systems are working. So there's your anti-collision devices are working. And when you first set off, you actually see quite a lot of human activity on the ocean. So there's local fishermen, there's local shipping and so on. And then as you get further away from land, then you've got more major shipping, but you see less of it. So during the day, you're kind of communicating with these people. You see them, you talk to them on the radio. Sometimes they'll answer you, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you have some quite amusing conversations with them, but you're also plotting your route. You're doing your navigation. You're making sure that you're on the right course. So there's loads of things that you're doing, and also you're eating because you need to eat. You're burning over 8,000 calories a day.
Wow. So what did you eat? How did you manage? I mean, other than you burning your own fat stores, what?
Yeah, so all that pizza and beer in Agadir got burnt off really quickly. But you're eating a lot of food that has high calorific intake. But the problem is you don't want to have too much weight in the boat. So you use dehydrated, freeze-dried rations, the sort of things you get for any outdoor activity. You add boiling water to that. And some of it tastes awful, and other you get to learn your favourites, and we had so before we had set off, we had made up daily ration packs for 2 people for 100 days. So there was 200 ration packs on board, and each ration pack would feed one man a day. So there was your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner, and various snacks throughout the day that was in each bag. And you would...
200 days is a long time to eat the same meal.
Yeah. But this is where it's really important that you have something that you can just add. So, both Dave and I had spent time in the military. We knew the old trick of making sure you had a bottle of Tabasco sauce that you could just add, that's just going to, add a little bit of flavour to it. You don't get, your usual condiments, or you don't have your can you pass the mayonnaise or the ketchup? You just haven't got it with you, But it is boring, but it's food. And when you're burning 8,000 calories a day, it doesn't
fuel,
matter.
isn't it?
It's fuel, and that's the way to look at it. And your body is asking for it. But there were treats in there. We made sure we had chocolate every day, you're just eating when you can. But sometimes, even though it sounds ridiculous, if you're burning that amount of calories, there's times you should eat, but you don't feel like eating. And in many cases that's dangerous, and so you need to encourage one another. Come on, mate. Get it down. You'll feel better for it later.
Could we talk a little bit about the mental game as well? So it sounds like it could be quite monotonous. I mean, I presume everything kind of after a while looks the same every day.
Everyone says that.
Really?
Yeah, and it's not.
No.
It's the total opposite.
Wow.
The sea is always changing. And looking at the ocean is quite meditative as well. So when you talk about the mental side of things, waves come from all angles. It's not like, they're just moving in one direction. And sometimes they come and sideswipe you, and it really knocks you off your seat, quite literally. So you're always on the lookout. But you also have some wonderful experiences out there when you have interactions with the ocean's inhabitants. So we had pods of dolphins that would quite literally come and visit us. And I remember one time I was in the cabin and I was trying to get some sleep. And this was late afternoon. And I came out of the cabin and I said to Dave, I just poked my head out of the cabin and I said, there's dolphins. And he thought I was hallucinating, because sleep deprivation, you get a fair amount of hallucination. And he said, just go back to sleep, mate, there's no dolphins. I said, no, there's dolphins. And he went, Lloyd, I can tell you, I'm on deck, I'm looking around, there's no dolphins. And I said, there's dolphins, I can hear them. And so the cabin was acting like a sound bell. And I could hear their voices, if you like, to one another. And then all of a sudden, we were surrounded by about 300 dolphins. But I had heard them a long time before we ever saw them. And so that sort of interaction, all of a sudden, once you see your first pod of dolphins, you're spending your time looking for the next pod of dolphins. And sometimes you see things. We saw a huge leatherback turtle, and we didn't know what it was until we got closer to it. Things like jellyfish. We saw Portuguese man-o-war jellyfish all the way across the ocean. And so we were actually doing some science while we were out there for the Earthwatch Institute, because we had a real advantage that we were such a slow-moving vessel. We were the perfect research vessel, because most research vessels move a lot quicker. So we were able to map the species of marine life that we were seeing. And then, of course, you see things you perhaps don't want to see, like sharks. And we had a shark. One in particular followed the boat for 4 or 5 days.
Wow.
Always staying about 4 or 5 meters off the back of the boat, but at night they would come really close. And we even had one that I was on the satellite phone to my wife, and there was a noise, and I thought, what on earth is that noise? And the light was dimming, and I looked over the side of the boat, and there was this huge shark, and it was rubbing itself on our hull. and probably trying to use the barnacles to get rid of parasites on its skin and things like that. So the marine scientists told me later. But, the problem is when you've got a boat that is 23 foot long, you've effectively got a ruler. So when you've got a shark that is over half the size of your boat, you've got a bloody big shark. You can measure the size of the shark. And you can also use your boat to measure the size of the waves when you're coming down them as well. So the last thing I said to my wife was, look, I've got to go. There's a really big shark rubbing itself up against the boat. And that's the last she heard from me for a week. So, but, the routine, there is no routine in many respects because everything is changing all the time. And at night, you're looking out for shipping. And you hear shipping quite a long way off, and then you see lights, and then you think, okay, they're on a collision course with us, and they're not responding, to radio signals. They're not responding to anything. So, you have to take evasive action when that happens.
How often did that happen?
Well, there was one night where I was on the oars, and Dave was resting in the cabin, and it's not going to end well where you can see both the port and starboard light of an oncoming vessel, and you try and signal them and they don't respond, and they're bearing down on you, and this is a situation I found myself in. So I tried to contact them, and I realised that this thing was moving really, really quickly. I shouted to Dave in the cabin, Dave, I need you to get on deck. And when you're in that cabin, you can't hear a lot because you've got the sound of the ocean banging up against the side of it. So he didn't hear me. He was asleep. So there I am, and I'm on deck, and I'm thinking they're not responding to anything. They're bearing down on us. I just need to row for dear life here. So I hit the rudder to hard port, and I just rowed. And this is where the training really comes in. All that hard training we did back on land. And I rowed and I rowed and I rowed, and this massive container ship missed us by about 20 feet.
Jeez.
And I know how close we were because as it went past, I could very clearly read the no smoking signs on its aft deck. And I thought to myself, oh my God, And then later that same evening, I was in the cabin and I wasn't sleeping particularly well. And I heard Dave shout to me, Lloyd, get on deck, get on deck. And I got on deck, and sure enough, same thing. There's another container ship bearing down on us. And I got on the radio, and I managed to get hold of them. And at the last minute, we changed course, they changed course. And we probably missed them by about 100 feet. And Dave turned to me and he said, oh my God, all the time that I've spent, at sea, he said, you just don't get closer than that without there being an actual collision. And I thought, I better not tell him what had happened a few hours earlier, where he was, within 20 feet of losing his life. But these were the things that you did. And we suddenly, going back to the risk assessment, we had all these anti-collision systems on board. But, they failed when in those two instances because it wasn't anything wrong with our equipment. It was the other vessel.
The other vessel's equipment.
Yeah, and either their equipment or they put their ship on autopilot, and the person who's on the bridge who's supposed to be monitoring the communications is asleep, and then you've got a catastrophic situation. So we realised at that point that nothing is infallible. You've always got to have backups. And the next night we saw this big trawler, and it was clearly laying lines, and again we went through all the same procedures, and they didn't respond. And so Dave just took out the flare gun and fired it at their bridge, and they did a 180, and we never saw them again.
Wow!
And we thought, well, that's the way to do it in future. so yeah, it was really. It's not boring.
No,
you're always doing something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. What about? So I imagine sharks they're not really thinking of you as prey, but there could be a mistake, and they don't know what to make of a small vessel.
It's interesting. So they're very curious. Mm-hmm. So sharks are very curious. Don't forget, you're also leaving a trail. Mm-hmm. So every time you throw waste overboard, including your own waste, the sharks scent that, they pick up on it, and that's why they would follow the boat. once you get off the continental shelf, there's less food for the sharks. So the sharks actually become a lot more desperate mid-ocean. So they will quite literally eat anything. So there's not that many, there's not the same quantity of fish once you're off that continental shelf. So the sharks become more of a problem. They are more, you see fewer of them, but they are more dangerous. So because we used to go for not swims, but we used to go overboard. We'd be, attached. We'd have a tether to the boat, but we'd go overboard to scrape the hull because you do collect barnacles on that, and it slows you down quite considerably. So we'd scrape the hull. We'd also wash, and just actually, because we had lots of sunscreen on us, trying to get that stuff off, you needed to get overboard and try and, get it off, and then you would put it on again. You would get skin disorders as a result of your skin not being able to breathe because it's got sunscreen all over it. So when we saw, one or two too many hungry looking sharks, we stopped doing that. But we always had, one person on lookout when you're doing that. But it was, just one of those things that you look at the risk and you weigh it up and you think this just isn't worth it anymore. Right.
So to deal with that, you just stay on board and...
Yeah. Yeah, okay. And one of the things you do is, you make sure you have a fresh water wash, but you can't afford to desalinate huge quantities of water for those sorts of washes all the time. So we used to use that as part of our dealing with mental adversity. We would always set things that we could look forward to. So one of the things that we really insisted on was having once a week. And we chose Sunday. I don't know why we chose Sunday, but every Sunday we would have a freshwater wash. And you speak to enough people who do expeditions and so on. And adventurers always seem to have this insistence that they must grow a really good beard. And I decided before we set off that I wasn't going to grow a beard at all. In fact, I was going to shave every week, and it gave me something to look forward to. Dave, on the other hand, had decided he wanted that, the bushy adventurer beard. So every Sunday we would both have a freshwater wash. I would wash all our clothes, so we had something nicer smelling to actually wear. We only had one set of clothes. And then I would have a shave, and I even took along a little bottle of Brute aftershave. And the reason I took Brute, it was the only one I could find in a plastic container. Okay. So I took that. So once a week, I would smell quite nice compared to everybody else on the boat, Dave. But it actually made me feel really good. And so even when you're going through the worst time ever, you've got something to look forward to. It might be in 2 or 3 days' time, but it was really, really important to have that.
That's great. And even if it's something quite simple, actually, I imagine it was quite a luxury to do that on the boat, but similarly, you can set yourself up to, I'm trying to think of some parallels to life outside of rowing across the Atlantic, and maybe just setting something up to look forward to that is just quite simple, but you can...
couples do it all the time, where they'll say, let's go out for a meal tonight, or once a month, let's go out for a meal. And it's a really good thing to do. Always have something to look forward to. And doing it on the ocean was no different. I think it probably just meant that much more.
Were there moments where you thought, oh my God, we're not going to make it, or what in the world are we doing here, or anything like that?
I never did. So the whole row took us 60 days and 17 hours. Okay, so 60 days, 17 hours. My worst day was day 31. So quite literally the day after the halfway mark. Of course, at the time we didn't know that was the halfway mark. But when we did actually hit the halfway mark, Dave Allred sent a text saying, because we got lots of texts on the sat phone saying, you've done it, you're over halfway, you've broken the back of it. And Dave Allred sent us a text saying, you're probably getting a lot of people sending you messages of goodwill. And he was the only one that recognised that this was probably our lowest moment, and it was. But only Dave and I knew that. And I remember that we'd had a lot of things that happened, massive seas, the shipping, incidents with near misses with shipping. We'd been knocked off our seats in big waves more times than we cared to remember. We'd bruised our ribs, our hands were, calloused and really, really sore. Our butts were a general plague area, and the whole thing was really, really uncomfortable. So we thought we'd actually been through everything. And I remember I'd just come on, Dave had gone into the cabin, and I was making myself a cup of tea early in the morning. And I was having my breakfast, and this wave came and it hit the side of the boat, and it tipped the boat over to the point that I thought, oh my God, we're going over, I'm going in. And just at that point where I thought it's going over, it self-righted. And the one thing I remember about it was that the ocean had spilt my cup of tea that I'd just made. And I went mad at the ocean. And I swore at the ocean, and I called it all the worst names under the sun. And for the rest of that day, I wouldn't speak to the ocean. I wanted nothing to do with the ocean. I hated the ocean. And yet, that evening, I made peace with the ocean again. But that was my lowest point, and that was just after the halfway mark. And that was the worst thing that really happened to me. Was I had a cup of tea down situation. And I even refused to make another cup of tea to myself. And I said to the ocean, see what you've done? No, I'm not going to have another cup of tea just so you can spill it. And I think to me that, when I reflect on that, I do think that it was indicative, it was a release of the things that we'd been through. I needed to have that moment. And then everything after that was absolutely fine. And, nature's got a really good way of showing you how powerful she is. That wave was an example of that, and yet that night we had such a clear night that I looked up, I saw the Milky Way, and it was as if I could reach and touch the Milky Way, and I thought, you can't buy this. There's nothing in life that gives you this. And so you out of adversity, you get to realize that you're such a small part of this incredible planet. And the one thing that came out of the whole exercise was we really need to look after our planet a little bit better, in fact a lot better, and the oceans are the key to that. And I've worked with a lot of conservation organizations both before, during and after that row, to make sure that we do everything we can to protect our planet. And this is why we talk about risk, but in the work that I do on a day-to-day basis with the trip group and everything else, it's really important that people do go and travel and they do go and push boundaries, because if they don't, we lose our identity and we lose our knowledge of why we're actually here as human beings and our part in the larger ecosystem of the planet. And it is so important. And if we sit looking at screens or at phones or laptops or whatever, we don't get that. We can't get it unless we're actually out there and we're actually doing it. And everybody has their own risk appetite. And I'm not encouraging people to go and row an ocean if that's not what they want to do. But get outside, walk in your local park, and start to actually understand, the planet that we're on, and that we owe something to that planet. So rowing the ocean gave me that, a really loud wake-up call as to the things that are important in life.
That's very beautifully put. Did you see evidence of the plastics in the ocean and things that you hear about?
No, we didn't, and I have to be really honest about that. I know other ocean rowers have, said that they saw plastic and they saw waste and so on. We didn't, I'll be honest. But part of that, I think, is because you're very low when you're rowing an ocean, and so you haven't got the sort of the field of vision that you would have if you were on a ship or something, or even a yacht. So we didn't, but we did research into, you know, the marine life that we saw, including, you know, some seaweeds and so on. But, you know, it was a small contribution. But when we fed that back to the various marine organisations, they were so thrilled, because we even saw a pod of a very, very rare species of dolphin, which is called a pygmy killer whale, although it's a dolphin. And we saw a pod between 8 and 10 of these things. And that was the first sighting they had of these things in a number of years. And the populations of pygmy killer whales have really, really diminished. You know, they are on the red list. And so for us to actually be able to give a confirmed sighting of them and pinpoint where it was through a GPS was gold dust to them. So, you know, for us, there was that contribution that we were able to add.
That's great. That's wonderful. Great to hear that. Could we talk about what it was like to finally finish or get a sniff of land, and what were the final few days like?
For me, the very worst day was my last morning at sea. I remember the sunrises and the sunsets when you're at sea are just incredible. And so when you said, you know, isn't everything the same? Doesn't it get a bit monotonous? No, it doesn't, because every sunrise is different, every sunset is different. And when I saw that final sunrise, you know, most people would say that they would feel elation. I felt really sad, and because it just felt that it was over, the adventure was over. And I looked at the ocean and I thanked her because she had allowed us to pass. You don't row an ocean. An ocean allows you to row it. And I knew I wouldn't be going that way again for a long time. And so I think it was a combination that everything that we had thrown into it, physically, mentally, financially, it was now over. And by the time nightfall came, we would be back on land where we belong, having had the adventure. So that was kind of, you know, a sad moment for me. But then as we approached Barbados and Port St. Charles, you get smells. The smells come across the sea. And then you start to see land and you see lights and all this sort of stuff. We arrived at night. And then we heard, you know, a lot of music. And we thought, well, it must be a weekend or something. People are having a party. And as we got nearer Port St. Charles, this music was getting louder and you could hear people cheering and laughing. And we were thinking, oh, my God, there's a hell of a party going on. What we didn't realise was that the party was for us. And that was incredible, because we had no idea that on social media there had been so much out there. People had tracked us, they were following us.
Did you, apart from these text messages, did you have any other contact with the outside world?
The only other outside contact we had, we said we'd call home once a week, and we stuck to that. And that came from other ocean rowers that said, don't call home all the time. It will make you miss home. It will also take away from what you're doing. Sometimes I wouldn't call home for 2 weeks. Not a lot to tell. But we did call in to our weather router to get weather checks. So that's the contact we had with the outside world. But when we arrived in Port St. Charles, there was this party going on, people cheering for us, Union Jack flags everywhere, and we just weren't expecting it. So that was actually difficult as well. And then you've been at sea for 60 days with just a bloke called Dave for company, and then all of a sudden you're the centre of attention. We got on shore, and suddenly you're having TV cameras thrust in your face and microphones and people wanting to talk to you, and can you do this interview? and they're asking you questions about things that are actually really personal to you, and you haven't had time yet to assimilate that in your own mind, let alone to a viewing public of you don't know how many. So that was difficult, and then everyone just expects, because you've done this thing, that you're going to want to have a party and celebrate. So I went and got a beer and I just walked off to my apartment, and that was the end of me. That was me for the night, and had a shower, needed one of those, and then went to bed and slept in a very curled up position, as I had done for the last 60 days, in a tiny corner of this bed. So I had this huge double bed and I was just curled up in a tiny corner of it. Then the next day you've got journalists calling, you've got people wishing you well and sending, congratulations. And to be honest, you're not ready for it. And I would say to people, if you go away and you do something, where you're away for a long period of time, and particularly if it's been so impactful on you, you need time. You need time on your own to be able to come to terms with what you have achieved. Because it's not just, as I said to you at the beginning, it's not just about that 60 days and 17 hours of rowing. It's about...
So 2 years before.
Yeah, it's about the sacrifices you made. And then all of a sudden you've achieved that. So, well, what do you do next? And you then go and give talks to people and, talks to schools and organisations, and they ask you questions, and invariably the first question that the audience or someone in the audience asks is, well, what's next? And I had a really good friend in Ireland who phoned me, and he said, how are the talks going? And I said, yeah, really well. And I said, I keep getting asked this question, what next? And he said to me, look, the answer to that question is simple. You just turn around and say, listen, I've just rowed across an ocean. I never have to do anything in my life ever again. What are you doing next? And I think that really is quite true. But I would say, if I had my time over again, that I would want to go on land somewhere really quiet, no crowds, no social media, no news reporters or anything else like that. And I would just want to go and spend a little bit of time adjusting to being back on land, being back in civilization, because I think that's part of it. And we when we got back to the UK, met up with the sports psychologists, and I think in many ways Dave adjusted to being back home much quicker and much better than I did. He had a young family, and he had actually a young child on the way. His wife was pregnant, so I think for him there was this real relief of being back, and he really wanted to embrace his family and so on. And for me, I just still missed the ocean. There was a part of me that wanted to drop Dave off in Barbados and then find the way through the Panama Canal and carry on and do the Pacific. But everyone is different, and that's the key point. When we all have different coping mechanisms for things, and I think that's a key part of it. Even when you're out there on the ocean, understand what your coping mechanisms are and when you're going to deploy them as well.
How long did it take you to feel normal? If we could even say,
I would. It came in stages. So when I was on the ocean, you kind of make deals with yourself that actually, because you've got a huge amount of time to think. It's like pressing the reset button on life, and you can go, okay, with my job I'm going to do this, and with my home life I want to do this. So you can set yourself real goals. You've got lots of time to think. Unfortunately, the world doesn't work that way. You make these plans and then someone lets you down. So I would say it probably took me a good 3 months just to get over the physical side of things, and also the mental side of things. I think that I did a lot of talks on it. So I went on the speaking circuit. I went on cruise ships, even went across the Atlantic again on a cruise ship talking about it. And I think that helped quite a lot. I think that physically you recover really quickly. I think mentally I missed it, and even to this day I miss it. But I also think that it does help you realise what you're capable of. So even in a work environment, you realise that when you're facing adversity at work, you can think to yourself, you know what, this is no different to what I faced out there, and so your coping mechanisms are a lot more robust, and also your tolerance levels are better as well. So you suffer idiots probably a little less, but you've got a little bit more patience as well.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Did you feel a sense of depression or melancholy at one point after finishing this, that it's all come to an end and I don't know what's next, or anything like that?
No, I never felt depression. I've got a very good friend in the States, Caroline Dunn, if you're listening, and Caroline her family live in Rhode Island. And I was working out in Boston, and so I went to see Caroline's family, they're old friends, and Caroline took me to their local beach, which is called Lloyd's Beach. And that was the first time I had seen the ocean again. So this is about a year afterwards. And that was the first time I'd seen the ocean from the west side, if you like, looking back. And I remember stood there on Rhode Island and looking back out at this ocean and thinking to myself, this is incredible. I am so pleased I had this time, the time I had with you. And I always remember every time I've flown over the Atlantic and how long it takes to fly over the Atlantic, I look at myself and I think, what on earth were you thinking that rowing that thing was a good idea? And indeed, when I went over on the cruise ship, you just realise how big it is. And to be honest, you don't realise that when you're rowing it, because it becomes a way of life. It becomes a part of you. You are absolutely ingrained, and you and the ocean are one. So when it spills your cup of tea on day 31, you get upset with it, and it is just an incredible thing. And again, I would just encourage people that if they have that, whether it's their Everest, they're rowing an ocean, whatever it is, do it, but plan it well. And really look at how you're going to enjoy it, not endure it. You are going to go out there and enjoy your expedition, something that is going to mark you as something different, but that you're going to actually really enjoy doing.
You're going to get into the process or the journey of it.
Yeah, and you have to. You have to live and breathe it. You have to be part of it. Some people don't enjoy these things, but you've always got to remember that if you undertake something like this, don't undertake anything half-heartedly. And that doesn't have to be a major expedition. That could be a project at work. But if you're going to do it, do it well. And as I say, enjoy it as much as you possibly can.
It's wonderful. I think that's a great way to wrap things up. Was there anything that you wanted to mention that you didn't get a chance to?
No, I think that's probably about it, really.
Wonderful. Lloyd, I loved this. This was fantastic, and I'm sure my listeners are going to thoroughly enjoy it as well. So thank you very much for coming back onto the show and sharing this great story with us. Before you go, was anything that you can mention in terms of how people can follow you and all of that good stuff on social media if they want to learn more?
So personally, it's on Twitter. It's at Lloyd Figgins. Same with Instagram. But I mean, where the real, the interesting stuff is happening is thetripgroup.com. So that's at the Trip Group on Twitter and on LinkedIn as well. We do some great risk management events. We get some great speakers in, really interactive community networking opportunities. Have a look at the Trip Group because you're doing all things risk. And I think that a lot of your listeners would love to get involved with the Trip Group, see what we're doing. And again, it's about enabling people, mostly people who are working overseas or, operating overseas, and they're worried about that travel risk side. We've got a huge community of experts that can help them with that. So, look at the Trip Group and get on board, join us, come to some of our events.
Brilliant. Lloyd, thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Always a pleasure.
I hope you all enjoyed that. And I think a great thing to take away from that episode, and there are loads of great things, this is just one, is for you to ponder that question. What are you doing next? That is it for now. Our next episode will be live in a couple of weeks. I wish you all a happy holidays and a wonderful festive season if you are celebrating. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.